Miles Morales is a launch-ish title for the PlayStation 5 and is a sequel-ish to the beloved 2018 hit Marvel Spider-Man. This, like the original, is an action-adventure game where you play as Spider-Man and swing around New York City, fighting bad guys, helping New Yorkers, and generally just having a great time. Like the title suggests though, you're not Peter Parker this time around. Instead, Miles Morales is a star of the show. That means you'll be introduced to a new family, friends, and all new characters to deliver this original-ish story. Featuring in this new iteration of Spider-Man is a fantastically updated combat system that manages to both feel more satisfying and look more flashy thanks to Miles' unique combat abilities. Lastly, Insomniac added a ton of quality of life improvements and straight up all-around welcomed additions such as improved visuals, a more unique color palette, updated UI, and a retouched open world. Whether you want to count this as a PlayStation 5 launch title or not, as it also launched on the PlayStation 4, or a sequel to Marvel Spider-Man or not, due to its short runtime, Miles Morales is a great game and a welcomed addition to the saga, and will surely satisfy anyone who enjoyed the original.
Here we go, found my position, let's hit the road. Came along, now my people here with me, I'm in my zone. Been around the block a time or two, I tell you where to go, I tell you how to move.
Leading up to the release of Miles Morales, there was some confusion around what type of game this was, and where it sat in terms of being a sequel or glorified DLC. Well, if you look back to 2017 when Uncharted The Lost Legacy came out, you'll get your answer. Miles Morales, like The Lost Legacy, follows a character or characters that were in the previous game but weren't the main protagonists. This time around, they're on a side journey that doesn't really impact the mainline games and lasts roughly half the length of their predecessor. Unfortunately, Insomniac and Sony did a terrible job explaining what type of game this was and left a bunch of fans disappointed that they didn't get more. I saw a lot of posts from people complaining that the game was so short and lacked the lengthy campaign of the original. The bloated length of both the story and the open world content in Spider-Man 2018 were some of my biggest complaints with that game, and here, that's all but non-existent. Where Spider-Man 2018 would take roughly 15 to 20 hours to complete its campaign, and maybe another 10 hours to 100% everything, Miles Morales is instead a punchy, focused, and more streamlined 6 to 8 hour campaign that personally took me 10 hours to 100% everything. Because of the shorter length here, the open world isn't as daunting as it was previously. Map markers felt like they never ended in the original, with the ludicrous amounts of collectibles to find and straight up terrible crime system, forcing you to swing around for minutes at a time, just waiting for another one to spawn so you can be that tiny bit closer to being done with it, definitely made the game drag for me. If you felt this way as well, then you'll be happy to know that Miles has far less open world busywork. Insomniac has cut down the amount of collectibles, enemy fortresses, minigames, and crimes are no longer mandatory in completing each section of New York City. Don't misunderstand me though, crimes are still part of the open world, but instead they've been added to an in-game app Miles uses, which also presents the side quests and activities to you. Personally, I found it far more engaging and gave a little bit more immersion into solving crimes, since people are posting asking for help instead of the map just telling you where to go. So yes, this is a shorter game than Spider-Man 2018, but I wouldn't call it a short game. 10 hours is still plenty of content, and that number definitely should not be a factor in scaring off potential buyers, especially when the game is this fantastic. Minutes into this review, and it's finally time to talk about gameplay. I'm going to assume anyone watching this has either played Spider-Man 2018 or is aware of what type of game this is. Miles Morales follows very closely to the original, featuring all of the same combos you've come to know and love. It features the same ledge-focused stealth sections, Spidey gadgets, and incredible swinging mechanics. But each area has been given a facelift with the addition of Miles' electrical abilities that the game awkwardly calls Venom attacks. You'll gain access to 5 Venom abilities throughout the campaign, as well as 1 additional ability for traversal. The first ability unlocked is the Venom Punch. With a simple press of a couple buttons, Miles will charge up an electrifying punch, knocking out the closest enemy. Later on, you'll unlock abilities that are much more interesting and will complement the gadgets that Miles has available. Unlike the original, where the enemy variety was focused around the different gadgets available, instead this time they're designed around Venom attacks. For example, towards the beginning of the game, you'll verse these guys who will block every basic attack, but with a quick Venom Punch, you'll either take them down or stun them long enough for you to take them down. Additionally, the reskin shielded enemies are weak to being thrown into the air in order for you to disarm them, and the rest of the new enemies all follow this type of design, and I find this much more enjoyable and engaging to play around with, rather than constantly going into my gadget menu, which momentarily halts combat, all to just press one button and instantly win. All in all, these new abilities are my favourite addition to the entire game and are the sole reason why combat is elevated to a new level, and they actually help to enhance all aspects of gameplay. During combat, you'll fill up an energy bar by hitting enemies. This is the same as it was in the original, but this time, instead of the energy bar being used for takedowns or healings, it's now used for venom attacks and healing. On top of this, the takedown function has been moved over and now requires you to get a 15-hit combo in order to bank a single use. This may seem like two tiny little changes, which ultimately they are, but they have significantly changed the flow of combat. Everything feels so much faster here, and because you now have multiple options, either doing a takedown or venom ability, and these come so rapidly with an exaggerated amount of particle effects coming off them, makes you feel like such a badass. Another thing I love is how well the different animations cycle between each other. Miles is so seamless in combat, and finishing an exhilarating fight with a takedown making Miles jump into the air, slowing down time, and hearing the bassy music drop always satisfies and keeps you wanting more. Moving on to gadgets. Like the length of the game, this has been cut in half with roughly the same effect. This time around you have 4 gadgets instead of 8. Each of them are a lot more distinct from each other than what was in 2018. As tradition would have it, Miles has the basic web shot, which is kinda useless unfortunately. I always have to force myself to use this, otherwise I forget it exists. Maybe if the basic web shot was the far more useful upgraded version from 2018, I would have taken advantage of this gadget more. Luckily the other 3 are very unique, and one of them is the best gadget in the franchise so far. Before I get to the great one, the other 2 are a decoy that helps you in combat by taking the enemy's attention off you for a brief second, and the other being an electrical mine that you can detonate at will. But this one is far more useful in stealth sections. The 4th and final gadget is a vortex orb that sucks in enemies in a small radius, which can be made bigger by the upgrade system, which works exactly like the original. The reason why the Vortex Orb is the best gadget in the franchise so far is because of how well it combos with the Venom attacks, more specifically, the area of effect attacks that either stun enemies where they are standing or throw them into the air. This combo between gadgets and fighting is something I didn't know I was missing from the combat, but definitely is the cherry on top of something already incredible. To finish up this section of gameplay, I do just want to quickly mention that if you love the gadget-focused combat of Spider-Man 2018, then you might be a little disappointed with what is available here, because one of the 4 has been copy and pasted from the original, one is predominantly stealth only, which only leaves 2 unique gadgets to play around with. Personally, I had no issues with this, because I was always lukewarm on the gadgets, and the addition of Miles' abilities is far more engaging. Lastly, regarding combat is the slightly updated stealth system. In 2018, I always felt like stealth was very optional, like it was kinda there, only to be used when snipers were in a combat arena, or you just wanted a breather from fighting. However, this time around there's a much larger focus on stealth. Firstly is the obvious addition of invisibility. Miles can turn invisible whenever he likes, meaning if you're in danger or screw up doing a stealth takedown, you can go invisible and start over. Insomniac must have known this would have made the combat laughably easy if the number of enemies on screen was the same as it was in 2018. As a result, some of the later areas are stocked full of enemies, and most of them are far more deadly. This makes stealth both balanced but also very necessary, because running straight into combat can and will frequently bombard you with an onslaught of enemies, making the game far more difficult than 2018. What helps to hold stealth up is the improved level design mixed with enemy placement and the stealth gadget. Typically, there will be no more than 3 enemies in a group, which requires patience to lure them away from each other or into an environmental trap. You'll never feel overwhelmed with each of the combat arenas if you take your time, use all the options given to you, and plan out your route. While this is minimally improved over 2018, it is an improvement, and honestly one of the better stealth systems in an action game. Moving on to the swinging, and it needs no introduction. This shit is incredible, and it was the best part of 2018, and it's the same here.
I took the message and sent it, felt like I was born for this minute, this is my time. I'm seizing the moment cause I gotta go for the time's gone. Ain't scared of the dark cause I'm bringing the light with a nice long.
Insomniac said one of their main goals with this game was to make Miles feel wholly unique from Peter, and the most important way to do that during gameplay was the change in animation. Since Miles is still learning how to be Spider-Man here, he swings with much less precision than Peter does. Instead, he is having much more fun with it. He's a lot more exaggerated, and this really makes Miles feel more interesting to control, even if it's just on a visual level. Alright, that's the combat section done. I think this game is the perfect example of how a few minimal changes can make way for some incredible improvements. Before we get to the story section, which, spoiler alert, I don't really like, I wanted to quickly mention all the little things Miles does better than 2018. The biggest upgrade and best change from the original is not the visuals. It's the complete eradication of the terrible Peter Parker science minigames and awful Mary Jane stealth sections. I'm so happy to say Miles Morales has removed most of the shit add-ons 2018 suffered from. What replaces them though is the new in-game puzzle sections that take control of Miles' Venom powers. Many of the puzzles here will be looking for lines of sight to connect power lines to generators. This isn't a groundbreaking design decision, but any step away from what was here previously is a major step up. Another step forward is the visual style here. Insomniac seems to have taken a note from Spider-Verse because the color palette and visual effects here are breathtaking. Both out in the open world and indoors, many areas will be throwing so much color at you constantly, and this is enhanced even more with HDR. You'll also notice how many visual effects are on display here. Snow is constantly falling, obstructing your view of the city in front of you, with the ambient light from all of the Christmas decorations surrounding the city streets. Likewise in combat, the effects shine brightest at night when the golden glow illuminates the area around you. The indoor areas are the same. Many times I was walking around in awe of the amount of colour being thrown at me. And all of this is enhanced by ray tracing, which beautifully reflects these neon-soaked environments. Insomniac also added an incredible visual mode that features both ray tracing and 60 FPS, and I have to say this is the best way to play. Because fidelity mode looks gorgeous, but playing at 30 FPS is not worth the visual upgrade. But ray tracing boosts the image so much here that lowering the resolution a little more in performance mode is worth it. Speaking of the technical aspects, I had one crash through my playthrough which required me to restart my PlayStation 5, and I only had one bug which caused my camera to get stuck on the other side of the battle arena. And finally, I only had frame drops during the final boss fight using ray tracing performance, but once you see the final fight for yourself, I'm sure you'll see why, because it's a real spectacle. It cannot be understated how much more visually interesting Miles is over 2018, and I hope the next game keeps the neon-soaked color palette. Maybe you realize that this open world is the same New York as it originally was, and you'd be right. I think it's kind of expected these days that a new open world game means a new open world to explore, but that's not the case here, and it doesn't need to be. Miles completely updates the scenery, whether that's the color palette, snow, debris, or decorations such as Christmas lights, or the side of buildings being painted. This open world never feels the same as the first rendition. Like I mentioned earlier, the open world is also filled with a lot less map markers, fetch and collect stuff making it less of a chore to 100% each region. Music has also been given a major facelift here. I found the original very forgettable and almost absent of music in many parts, but Miles completely changes this. The music is fast-paced, it's loud, and it adds so much character to the game. Yes, once again, it's a lot like Spider-Verse, but that's not a bad thing, and I would take that over forgettable every time. Lastly, these all relate to the PlayStation 5 version of the game. Loading is near instant with both fast travel and loading in-game, and the SSD allows for a much denser crowd population, which helps to bring the city to life just that little bit more. Using the DualSense 5 controller is a joy as always. Miles Morales features adaptive triggers while web swinging, however, the haptic feedback is far greater here than it was in the remaster of Spider-Man. Here every punch feels much meatier than it did before, and there's a lot more environmental interactions. The very first scene in the game actually shows off the haptics with the train going along the train tracks. Once again, this is a bunch of tiny little improvements that add so much to the experience. Whether it's the improved visuals, the improved sound design, the improved open world, the nice PlayStation 5 features, they're all amazing and all just add that little bit more to the game. Miles Morales has a dull and formulaic story made worse by its mishandling of villainous characters. This is the only aspect of the entire game that I regard as worse than the original. And while this isn't a horrible story at all, as it features almost all of the good things from its predecessor, and even improves on a few things such as pacing, and the cutscenes are much more dynamic and interestingly shot, it does unfortunately also have many of the weaker aspects that I did not like. This game follows Miles Morales, a 17-year-old kid from Brooklyn who is learning how to handle being Spider-Man and the responsibility that puts on him, all while family drama is going on in the background. Let's cover the good things first. The characters you loved from the original are here and are just as great. Peter Parker, while briefly in the game, is the same great Peter you always knew, and his personality bounces off perfectly with Miles, who is developed here fantastically. Miles obviously has much more to do here, and grows in all the ways you hoped he would. Much like Peter, he is funny and lovable, but in his own unique way. Sadly, the side characters fumble here. There's a character who fills the same role as Yuri from the original game, with even less character development. Much of Miles' family is kinda just there as plot devices, but don't really do much or impact the story. There's some other characters here as well that are just shoved into the plot for whatever reason, but hey, Spider-Verse had them, so this has to as well. But the side characters kinda just being there is fine. This is a shorter game, so it's kind of expected, and as a superhero story, the side characters here clearly represent aspects of Miles. But the worst part of the story is the villains and the wasted potential here. Of course I won't spoil anything, so I'll be a lot more vague than I wish to be, but if you loved what 2018 did with its villains and the larger story as a whole, take my criticism with a grain of salt, because I'm sure you'll like this. Like 2018, this game features too many villains that are useless. If you watched the trailer, you would have seen the Tinkerer, who should have been the only villain for this shorter, more condensed story. But of course there's a second villain, and later a third rivalry to deal with. The problem with this is each character doesn't have enough time to breathe. They're just being thrown into scenarios doing bad shit. Later in the game, you'll find out these villains also oppose each other, which could create some extra drama or even possible character growth, but that never happens. Characters never feel like they're going to change or are in a moral dilemma because conflict will start and be resolved in the same scene. This is the same with mysteries, as questions will be brought up but answered just a few minutes later. And this isn't an issue with the length of the game, it's an issue of forcing too much into what should have been a simple story. Lastly and most importantly is the tragic ending that makes Miles grow as a character, but failed for me as the game was asking me to care about a character who is visually showing killing civilians and destroying New York. Trigger warning here, the reason why Abby works in The Last of Us Part 2 is because we see her developing as a character. She grows a lot. From where she starts to where she finishes is two completely different places, and she doesn't kill innocent people. How did Insomniac ever think this was a good idea? If I can wish for anything in the next Spider-Man game, it would be to only have one or two villains, give them some real character development, and make their goal interesting instead of recycling the same idea from the last game. And if you're going to make Spider-Man emotionally invested in the villain, which he most likely will be considering the villain Insomniac keeps teasing, make us, the player, care about the villain as well. Because Insomniac is capable of writing great, interesting, and engaging characters. I just want them to succeed with the characters that aren't called Spider-Man. I know I just put the story down quite a bit, but Miles Morales is a great game. It does what any sequel should do, which is take the best parts of the original and expand on them, whilst creating its own sense of identity. An average story doesn't ruin this game because everything else is the best it has ever been. Gameplays, visuals, set pieces, and a streamlined open world makes Miles Morales a far more focused and enjoyable game than Spider-Man 2018. This is a fantastic launch title for the PlayStation 5 and should be in everybody's PlayStation collection. Lastly, I'm very excited to see where Insomniac takes this franchise, whether that is with Peter or Miles.
Daily Bugle saved.
Thanks for watching my review. If you liked it, maybe consider subscribing, and my next video will be on the Final Fantasy VII Remake.